This is the second presentation on art, and each of these groups of presentations form a phase. And altogether, in our education, there are 8 phases. And you'll recognize that the 8 phases are very much like the octave in musical scalar notation. You might also be aware, and if not, you can be informed, that there are an infinite number of musical scales, although most Western music uses the octave scale, which comes directly from ancient Greece because of Pythagoras and because of Plotinus. Pythagoras, who discovered the basis of mathematical proportions in this particular sound continuum, and constituting then the first musical scale which could be indexed exactly in terms of a mathematical representation and presentation both. The Chinese have, as their archetypal musical scale, a pentatonic scale, 5, because it is based upon the energy circulation of Tao, the 5-phase energy cycle of Tao, Tao, Te, Gen, Yi, Li. But in the West, we have an 8-part, and our education, because of my particular limitations and because of the conditions which I had to respect, uses a Western archetype, but I provide all the necessary means for you to, if you would rather live Chinese style, to make a transformation from the octave to the pentatonic scale. Now this 8-part phase, this 8-phase education cannot all be seen at the same time. This limitation is not due to the fact that we're not of superior intelligence. It's not due to the fact that we're just mere terrestrials and don't have UFO capacities, that we're not some kind of super mutants. It doesn't matter what star system you come from. It does not matter how mutated your evolution is. No entity that is conscious can view all 8 phases accurately at the same time. It is a gestalt that is not observable in a visual mode at all. Now, why this is so is very complex. Once upon a time in India, about 2,500 years ago, one of the most exacting contemplatives of all time, the historical Buddha, used his great insight to look at a moment of thought, an atom of thought, called a citta. And he looked at a very special case of a moment of thought, the moment that the thought of enlightenment begins in a sentient being, called the bodhicitta. And because this was of great interest to him, he looked at it as exactingly as is possible and found that the bodhicitta, and in fact all cittas, all moments of thought, all atoms of thought, have 16 parts, only 8 of which can be designated, and the other 8 always occur in an invisible trill. They never occur distinctly. That in all the variations of universes that are possible, that have ever happened, ever will happen, only 8 out of the 16 are discernible, and the other 8 always occur as an invisible trill. And in the advanced Abhidhamma commentary on Buddhism, the kind of discussions that finally came out about the nature of this invisible trill translated very nicely into Chinese thought about 700 years later as the quality of movement, whereas the 8 that were discernible had the quality of, I guess we would use the term presence, although the English translation of the Chinese term translates exactly as stillness, so that stillness and movement are a parallel, complementary aspect of what is real. And that movement, thank God, is not objectively discernible. Otherwise, it would not be movement. It would be stillness. And the properties that are necessary to movement in the universe to constitute that aspect of the real would not occur. And what is still, because movement would not be real, would crumble and collapse and not be. So that fortunately for reality, only half of reality is at any given time objective, no matter who the hell you are, or who the hell you think you are, or who the hell your guru is, or what dimension or star system they came from, or what channel you're channeling on. It doesn't make any difference at all. So that in wisdom traditions, East and West, there's a consistent recognition that if we're going to address the real in any workable, not to say mature way, there's a deep symmetry between stillness and movement, and that their symmetry is of such a nature that if you increase one, you decrease the other, and that this relationality has a pair of possibilities. One is that they are contravariant, and the other is that they are covariant. Now, all of this is a very clever, hopefully, lead-in into nuclear physics, which in itself is perhaps a trite lead-in to art. I'm sure that all of you have heard of Einstein. Is there anyone here who hasn't heard of Einstein? And most of you have heard of Niels Bohr, and perhaps even of Heisenberg. But I would dare say that very few of you have heard of Levi-Civita. Tullio Levi-Civita of Rome? No, you haven't heard of him? Well, once upon a time, this book was quite astounding. It summarized a great deal of a process that dealt with the deep parallels in reality. This book by Tullio Levi-Civita is called The Absolute Differential Calculus. It's a mathematical treatise on the development of a mathematical procedure that was indispensable for Einstein to use in the theory of relativity. That without the calculus of tensors, Einstein would not have been able to think clearly about this. We know this from his own writings. If you get a chance sometime, you might get The Principle of Relativity, a collection of papers, Albert Einstein and a number of others, and you can go to page 121 and read through to 123. It'll take an afternoon. But the way Einstein writes here is very interesting in comparison to the way that Einstein wrote just a few years before. a few years before, Einstein was writing very much like you would find in this collection of 5 little papers by him on Brownian movement. Brownian movement. Brownian movement comes from an Englishman. You notice how many great problems come from Englishmen. About the time that the spirit of William Blake was heading for the happy hunting ground, Robert Brown got curious about mixing certain chemicals together and watching them churn around in the beaker. And he was absolutely fascinated by this. And I must say that I feel very kin to him because as a little boy, I used to go into my grandfather's tool shed and pour odd chemicals together and watch them swirl around in the cup. And I had the same intuition that Brown had, and I was just as gullible as him, because both of us assumed that there was something alive in this beaker. I mean, look at it go. And there are some things that you mix together, paint thinner and other things, and they churn so determinedly, willfully, one might almost say, that you think, my God, what's going to come out of here? And I'm sure that many human beings in the post-chemical age have gone into this. Well, Brown assumed that there was some kind of primitive molecule that was the trigger key to all life, and that all matter had this, and that somehow mathematically someone would figure this out. And Einstein, when he had nothing else to do, took up this problem mathematically. And of course, by his time, by about 80 years later, after Brown and Einstein being German-Swiss and not English at all, he recognized in a more concerted continental style that this was due to heat differential on the molecular level. And so theory of heat, called thermodynamics, entered in, and all of this mathematics involved a curious kind of area of mathematics that had something to do with notations that an Englishman, very un-English-like, named James Clerk Maxwell, was working with electricity and magnetism. And it interested Einstein that these mathematical equations had cousin-like qualities, and he got very interested in this, and out of this came the theory of relativity, which has 2 versions, by the way. It has a general theory of relativity that most of us pretend that we've heard about. And then there's a specific theory of relativity that is a special case where you don't take into consideration gravity, which is rather delusional because gravity is rather omnipotent in this universe. And so the special theory of relativity is sort of a mathematical recreation, technically. It's meant to hone your mind, whereas the general theory of relativity is not established because no one really knows about gravity. Although at Caltech there's a whole laboratory devoted to the study to try to find the particle of gravity, the graviton, and Kip Thorne and a number of other individuals over there are happily working at this mad enterprise. I imagine from time to time Francis Crick pokes his head in to see if they're still mad, and they're still doing it, and they are. All of this is a clever lead-in to nuclear physics, which is a lead-in to art. And all this while, we have a sculpture by Rodin here of 2 lovers, the kiss. Notice that love is an energy that requires symmetry also. Asymmetrical love is very English and frowned upon, whereas symmetrical love, having a whole universe of variations, nevertheless generates an actuality. It's a force field. Now there's something very peculiar about this. What's peculiar is that the power of a symmetrical form increases the more energy that one puts into the phase level of its actuality. That on a very low level of energy, pairedness is comme ci, comme ça. And as you raise energy levels, pairedness becomes more and more alert as a almost conscious recognition of its purpose and its place. And at very high energy levels, symmetry is the trigger that allows for something which we would call transformation to actually happen in terms of being able to apply to the real world the results. In fact, one of the great seers of all time, Walt Whitman, when he was thinking things through after the death of Lincoln, he took it upon himself for about 10 years to think through this universe. And he wrote a beautiful volume called Democratic Vistas. And in it, Whitman said, though cultural bias may object, there seems to be only two qualities that nature respects: freedom and variation. This is what nature actually respects: freedom and variation. And that those two qualities must be untrammeled by human projection and laws in order for anything that we do to be actually real. We must respect freedom and variation without limit. This is very difficult. Now, freedom, it turns out, works better and better as symmetry is given free rein to explore its either covariant or contravariant quality variation. And that this produces something that goes completely against common sense, and yet modern mathematics has developed a very exquisite way of talking about and describing, thanks to Tullio Civita and Einstein and Bohr and the whole raft of physicists and mathematicians, Stephen Hawking and Roger Penrose and the whole crew, that what goes against common sense and yet is actually true is that as long as you raise the energy of symmetry, you can increase the variables and come out with a clearer and clearer picture of what is real. Whereas common sense always says you have to reduce the variables to get down to what it is. And you have to collapse the symmetry to oneness, to the thing. And when you have collapsed the symmetry to this flat oneness and reduced the variables to absolute minimum, then you have the thing. And thingness is, if I may, a disease that inhabits a great many brains on this planet. One is reminded of the beautiful Howard Hawks science fiction thriller, The Thing, and John Carpenter's weird and wacky Steve Martin-esque version of The Thing. Thingness is something to really be abhorred by, it turns out, in terms of Mother Nature. She really doesn't like thingness. She likes freedom and variation. And she allows for an infinite variation with an infinite energy that keeps symmetry exact. She loves this kind of realm. And in doing so, she creates what we experience as the universe. Now, it's very difficult to approach this universe. The only way in which to begin to approach this universe is through a direction that keeps an orientation long enough for you to make use of it, but long enough also so that you learn to be able to forget it and let it go. Now, what satisfies these two rather disparate conditions and qualities is a line that disappears. A line that allows us to align points together long enough to see that this is a line and that it goes somewhere. It develops a direction. It's called a vector. And that this vector sometimes is so long that, like Wallace Stevens in his theory of poetry, where he quoted Paul Klee in his theory of the thinking eye, said, "A true artist lives in a universe so vast that straight lines seem to fall." And this happens to be real. We live in an artistic fullness in a universe so vast that straight lines fall. Not only do they fall, but they fall out of view. It's somewhat interesting that in a parallel, our life form grew up on a planet where if you look out to sea and you see the horizon, if you're high enough and you're sharp-eyed enough, you can actually see that the horizon curves. The ocean is not a flat plane at all, but it's a great curvature. And I know that the experience when you're first conscious of being out of sight of land on a huge body of water, it's very interesting to be in a realm where the entire 360-degree horizon falls away from you. Melville in Moby Dick talks about the young novice Platonists who go up into the crow's nest, the tip-top of the whaling ship, and they move with the waves of the sea, and this falling horizon of the complete sphere of the globe envelops them in this kind of dreamy state. And he says it's not advisable to do this because many a young Platonist has taken his first step into a new world and plunged off into the sea with that first step, rarely to be recovered. He adds poetically, when Pip, the little cabin boy, falls into the sea, that he went so far down before he came back up and they rescued him. He went so far down that he saw God's foot on the treadle of existence. Water and meditation are wedded forever in Melville. All of this is a very friendly way of saying something that is very perilous. It means that our sense of certainty when it comes to thingness is misplaced. It's mistaken. And that certainty resides in an artistic realm of total freedom, of infinite variabilities, of unknown dimension. And that infinities and voids are not terrifying parentheses as it was for at least 1,500 years to the Western mind. For about 1,500 years, the best of the personalities of the West shied in between these two fierce, Scylla and Charybdis. That one would be swallowed by the void, or one would be diffused by infinity, and that this was somehow so terrible that it was better to live as intellectual slaves on a borrowed Roman Empire theology than to explore. The most fabulous myth about this is the one about Columbus, who braved sailing out across the Atlantic Ocean when everyone knew that the world was flat and you would fall off the edge. It's the same thing now, that everyone knows that if you go faster than the speed of light, you simply won't exist. all of these are rather like the idea of the sound barrier, that no plane could break the sound barrier because it would just fall apart. And how beautifully Philip Kaufman in The Right Stuff showed, with Sam Shepard playing Chuck Yeager in 1947, October 14th, breaking the sound barrier, and everyone expected that he would just crash into a wall because the molecules of the air couldn't get out of the way. Well, he didn't believe it existed, but what he did believe existed was an old demon that lived out there, courtesy of our fear. And that old demon kept living at faster and faster speeds. And when we broke the sound barrier, he once realized that it wasn't at Mach 1, which was the sound barrier, that the demon lived, or at Mach 2, because his buddy Scott Crossfield had broken that. He got the idea from a man not mentioned in the film, but one of the great test pilots named Ivan Kinchlow, that the old demon lived out there about Mach 2.5. Because they had gotten glimpses of him. And very beautifully, Kaufman put in the film exactly what happens when you get up around Mach 2.5. That visually, the projected space, the apparent dimensions of open space at that kind of speed began to have a contravariant whirlpool effect, and it spins and makes a hole in the sky. Hence, the jet pilots always talking about punch a hole in the sky. Don't be afraid of that. It is there, but it's there as a function of your participation in reality, of that energy, and you belong there. It wouldn't be there unless you were there also, and the two of you are covariant there. And this is just how man learns to condition away fears that are so deep, so primordial, that for 1,500 years almost nobody even dared brush up against them. And so the courage of modern men and women is extraordinary, just like the great age of mythic heroes. But while we have the courage, we have the character, we have the dedication, we often don't have the one more indispensable dimension needed, an education. And in that, we are sorely let down by what exists on a so-called professional level. It might have been all right for medieval mentalities, for common sense limitations, but the current education shies away long before it even comes to grips with the perils of reality. And what we do here on Saturday morning is we punch a hole in the sky. And we do that together in such a casual way, friendly way, that it's only years later when you think back upon this that you'll realize that this was a high wire act without a wire. Now, it's very difficult to recognize the ancient wisdom tradition when it's presented to us in the modern world. We're sold a bill of built goods of thinking that it looks like it used to look, and that if somebody presents something that is a good imitation or a good copy of the way it used to look, like an alchemical book. If you print something up on big, huge, crinkly pages with esoteric beakers and all this kind of thing, and puffy men, women with suns and moons and all this stuff, that this is somehow an alchemical text, an alchemical book. And those are museum pieces. Those are film props. A real alchemical book, it looks like this now. This is a real alchemical book. It's published by McGraw-Hill Science Books in the Metallurgical Text Series, 1929. It's called A Manual of Fire Assaying. And it's a 1929 version of the strict technical alchemical material, written by a director of the Missouri School of Mines and Metallurgy, co-authored by the Homestake Mining Company president. It's a real book on alchemy, of just how you do things, how transformations in metals are made. I know that you won't find this usually on shelves of alchemical books, but that's where it belongs. This is to say that we must now learn to reserve our judgment, to suspend our belief, and not to just buy the Brooklyn Bridge just because it's a bargain. I know it's only $1. Relinquish the urge. Try to have the quality which is indispensable in art. It's an aesthetic precondition in a way, and that is to suspend your judgment. Not dispense with it, not throw it away, but suspend your judgment. And suspend it as consciously as you can in a universe large enough to permit freedom and variation to be as they are, as large as they need to be, as strange as they need to be, as ordinary as they need to be. And it's under that kind of a hiatus of linear judgment that what we call the creative process actually works. This entire process, the creative process, was looked at assiduously in the 1910s, the 1920s especially, the 1930s, looked at assiduously during that time, and around 1950, a beautiful book was put out in Berkeley, as a matter of fact, by the University of California Press. Brewster Geeslin was the editor. It was called The Creative Process, and he took excerpts from, I think it was 38 great creative artists in the world: Mozart, Max Ernst, Carl Jung. And he took extracts from their letters, their journals, their published works, their statements, their interviews, of the moment of creation for them. How does the creative process work for you? And he showed, for the very first time, for our general inspection, that across the board, math, science, painting, sculpture, poetry, psychotherapy, across the board, human creativity has a remarkable similar pattern, in that the moment of creativity is not discernible. It's no longer a point on a line, even though there was definitely a linearity. Before that, that linear vectorial direction was relinquished, and in the relinquishing, some other level came into play, and when the line took up again, it came exactly at the point where the creative takeoff was. That the point of creative insight, the point of creative takeoff, was a mixing together of the invisible and the visible, of the stillness and the movement, of linearity and of nonlinear. And that when they were brought together exactly at the point where creativity takes off. That point is the bodhicitta of art. That's where a work of art, that's where an artist and the work of art are born together at that moment. We have a mathematics that's capable of expressing that to any degree of exactness now that you would want. It's very difficult to speak it. I can't pronounce it. I can barely read it. But what we need to do in this education is not get ourselves into a mathematical education to try and learn that universal language so much as to just relax a little bit and let the course of this phase of art proceed. Let's journey together in this phase. And since we're journeying in a phase, we would like to identify for ourselves or locate for ourselves some practical way of keeping track, not only of where we are, but keeping track so that we can then let it go and let the not keeping track quality have its juicy way of digesting so that a creative moment can come for all of us. Here's the way to keep track of the line, of the linearity. In our education, we have an octave. We have 8 phases. Only 4 of them can be kept track of at any one time. And the peculiarity, initially, is that as we began our education with nature, nature became the very first phase, and the second phase was ritual. And we notice that nature is a dynamic matrix of change, not at all objective, and that ritual is an objective phase that we could rightly call existence. That whatever we do, that action posits existence. So that in a very peculiar way, movement makes objectivity and stillness makes the non-objective. Now this is very peculiar because it goes against what is experienced later on. That one has to become quiet, contemplative, meditative to discern objectivity. Yes. Whereas in nature, one has to move. If one is quiet in nature, objectivity disappears. The phantasmagoria of reality is infinite and endless when one is quiet in nature. One has to move, and movement objectifies, makes a focus which holds. It's only the movement of the electrons around the protons and the neurons, which are moving in their particular pattern, that make atoms real. Otherwise, they wouldn't occur. If you stopped all electron action, if you stopped all nucleon action, if there was no momentum, there would be no atom. So the first thing we need to recognize, the new common sense, is that objects, in order to be real, move. They have momentum. And that momentum has a correlate energy, which is specific and exact. As one increases the molecular quality of atoms brought together, you get more and more complex levels of energy. Even on the atomic scale, as one moves from hydrogen to helium to lithium to oxygen to iron, so on, there's more and more complexity, and the movement records in such a way that the electrons are only real, their movement is only real at specific energy levels. They do not record just haphazardly, but only at specific energy levels, so that energy has a gauged quality of levels which is correspondent with the existence of movement. Let's come back to our education. We can only keep track of 4 phases at any one time. So if we have nature, and we have ritual, which is existence, and then we found that the third that comes out of that is the level of language, of experience, called myth, and at the fourth level is the level of symbol, of mind, of interiorization of language through meaning. So that in our first year, we generated and developed 4 of the phases: nature, ritual, myth, symbol. And those 4 hold together. In fact, they integrate in such a way that you can integrate it to any degree of specificity, including a vanishing point of realization. But when you move beyond mind, when you move into what used to be called magic, nature as a phase which is there no longer records. And instead of having nature as it had always been at the basis of the quaternary, nature now becomes invisible and a supernatural quality. It used to be called magic. We're using the term developed in medieval times around Chaucer's time of vision. The English term vision is much better than magic. So that the new square is ritual, myth, symbol, vision. Nature is invisible. It doesn't record. And if you move then one more phase beyond vision to art, which comes after. Art is a phase after magic. Art is a phase after vision. Ritual disappears. And the new square is myth, symbol, vision, art. So that art is a very rarefied realm of the objective real. And its characteristic is that ritual is displaced by art. That the person displaces existence as the rooting quality of what is discernibly real. It doesn't mean that existence goes away. It doesn't mean that nature goes away. It's that they do not record, because only that square, only that quaternary, only that records at any given time. And we will see that one of the most scary of all developments is the one after art, which is history. Because in history, the third phase, which is myth, which is language, disappears from view. And in a kind of a contravariant way, just as art displaces ritual, history displaces myth. It's not that myth goes away. It's still very powerful, necessary, but it does not record any longer. History records in that place. But notice what has happened. What begins with vision is that vision records where nature was, but vision records in the fourth corner instead of the first. Nature always was in the first corner. In announcing the struggle for existence, the announcer always announces nature first. And in this corner, the grand champion of reality, Mother Nature. But when you get to a certain, and this is why it's called a transformation, crossing over form. Vision is a transformation of nature. Art is a transformation of ritual. Now, just as vision gains then all of the efficacy of nature, can you imagine how powerful vision is? It has all of the efficacy of the universal matrix of change that is nature. Vision is truly Sophia. Mother Nature becomes Sophia. But art is so important that it takes on all of the characteristics of existence. The artist becomes as important as the author of existence. Not in some kind of sentimental way, not a metaphor, not a paradox also. But through this transformation, the parallel principle, both covariant and contravariant, either way, you can develop the mathematics of it very easily. This is something that we need to take a look at. And in order to take a look at it, we need to have some sense of how lines which develop can disappear, and even though you can't count them, they still work. Now, one of the great developments along this line was due, wouldn't you know it, to an Englishman. This one was named Hamilton. And he came up with a rather stupid, beautiful idea that a point can be a field of points called Hamiltonian space. And after the break, if you're still here, well, we can talk about it. I was reminded of the early days of radio. One of the most charming aspects of the science fiction film The Day the Earth Stood Still is that they have all the radio personalities from the 40s on film. H.V. Kaltenborn and Drew Pearson and all the Walter Winchell, all those wonderful radio personalities. We talked about last week how the generation of boys and girls raised on radio have tremendous imaginations, and how that generation went to the moon, and how the generation raised on television have atrophied imaginations, but much more money, and so they go to the computer store. The development of imagination is very difficult and was always attended in the finest educations with very great care. The reason being is that imagination comes into play in the realm of language. Language brings imagination into play. And the function of language is very much a part of the way in which the imaginative activity happens. And one must be aware that there is a musical imagination as well as a visual arts imagination. There are imaginative realms to all of the senses, to smell, to taste. There are very few people who are schooled so that their imaginative control of taste is able to be transformed and raised to an art. Very often you will find in some old vintner company, some old vineyard, some individual who can at a sip taste whether or not this wine is going to 10 years from now be potable and worth such and such and so. It's a very great art. The same thing for perfume makers. The one region where perfumes were perfected in France is the region where they grew the most flowers, the most varieties of flowers. And those individuals were sensitive to the slightest nuance of scent, able to be transformed into an intuitive grasp of just how a combination of 700 or 800 ingredients were going to produce a new perfume that would make Coco Chanel rich beyond imagination. Number 5. I imagine that's how voila got into the language. When she looked at her checkbook and said, oh. And I think she's the originator of the phrase, let's go shopping. In order to help us focus on this most delicate situation, let's have a couple of quatrains from Schiller in translation. This poem is called The Flavor of the Moment. Here are 2 quatrains from Schiller's Flavor of the Moment. From the clouds must fortune fall, from the lap of deities, and the mightiest lord of all is the moment as it flies. 'Mongst the things that have their birth 'neath eternal nature's sway, naught is godlike here on earth, save the thought's all-piercing ray. How about that for Hermetic wisdom? Goethe and Schiller and company. It's generally not appreciated, but what was more powerful than the gods in Greek mythology was something outside of mythology called Moira. Moira was fate or destiny. Even the gods are subject to Moira. This is why Prometheus can take his patient, painful way about Zeus. That's right, you're all powerful. You can stomp on me or anything. You have all the power, but you do not have all the time. And there will come a time when you are dethroned. And he who will dethrone you will be man. Seemingly this puny, punny, scavenger primate lurking here and there among the gargantuan dinosaur appetites of the gods, that is the successor to your power. It is he who will win out, who will take command of your powers. Unlikely as it seems by common sense. Because the gods could not understand. They cannot understand fate, destiny, providence. They cannot understand the invisible matrix of mystery, while we can. For the gods are mythic images. They occur in the natural integral cycle. And those mythic gods, like Zeus, are not transformable. Oh yes, they can change shapes. Can become a cloud of golden coins for one, a great swan for another, a bull for another. Ah yes, that's not transformation. Shamanistic shape-shifting, try and say that huffily. It ain't it. Transformation means moving across. It's like a diagonal moving across from an initial corner to a culminating corner. Moving across, like nature transforming into the supernatural into magic, into vision. Consciousness is not in nature's integral path. Although tremendously powerful mathematical techniques for tracing integral paths, consciousness is not there. And when it is there, the natural basis of integration is no longer there. Which is why abstraction is a supra-integral context. And in order to even describe it mathematically, you have to stop talking about analysis and start talking about super-analysis, which is done. It's done every day in every university in the world. There are courses on super-analysis. There are textbooks on it. You have to get into 1995. Part of the difficulty of understanding this is obviated, that is to say, the difficulty is obviated if you have a geometrical model like our square to initially give us some kind of orientation, and you keep in mind the proviso that you do not use it as a crutch but as a frame of reference. Like when he was getting into his dynamic phase, Michelangelo Antonioni used to carry around a slide with no picture in it. And he used to always just hold it up to his eye to frame and get his eye trained to see what was going on in terms of what could be shot, what could be framed. But he was sensitive enough. He was patient enough. Like an old hunter waiting for elusive game. He had to wait until it moved, and then he could see it. And filmmakers like Antonioni and Jean Renoir had this tremendous patience of the inner eye to follow a stillness or a silence or a seeming unformed movement until the moment came when there it was. That's the picture that you want. That's the anchor point upon which the whole composition of this episode of film can be based. Now we have it. Now we have something to work with. And so very frequently Jean Renoir would say, well, the screenplay is a nice beginning, but it's not what I'm going to make the film on. I will make the film on the activity that's happening on the set. Because somewhere in that activity, I will find the real starting point for each scene, for each episode. And it takes an artist to appreciate that. Or for English, appreciate that. That quality is appreciable and eminently worthwhile. Our education is to sensitize us to the fact that we can wait out the mediocre, and our patience will be rewarded by an insight, a flash of insight, by an insight which will have a definite location and a definite starting point if we have preceded the insight by a patient aligning ourselves and then letting the alignment go. Not fallow, but into mystery. So there's an art, there's a technique to letting linearity go so that it curves into the mystery of life and not just dissipates itself into the nonchalance of stupidity. And so much in contemporary lives do not come to fruition because people just let it go to the point of actually being exercises in diffusion, and the only thing that comes out of that is anxiety. The source of anxiety is diffusion of instinctual form, not repression. If it were simply repression, one could mechanically fix the whole thing. But diffuse form requires refocusing. And not at all the kind of sophomoric procedure that goes under that name in certain psychological volumes. Let's reconsider the line for a second. We're using a pair of books, a symmetry of books, all the way through this course. Every phase, all 8 phases, we use the method of a powerful symmetry, a pair of texts, so that we can raise the energy level to whatever level we would like, and it will still hold form. But it holds form not in the initial sense of a natural form. What a highly energized symmetry does is allow for form to come back, to re-emerge out of mystery, to re-emerge out of this mystery, back into its place, back into its reality. Now you can use the term re-emerge, or you can use a term that mathematical physics uses, renormalize, renormalization. You can use this creative term that you pick up exactly at the moment of insight. What is necessary are 2 phases, one a process and one objective, working together, one of them working objectively by being there, the other working mysteriously by not being there. That if the other was there, then it wouldn't work. And what's objectively there is not, according to common sense, what's there objectively. It's what's there in terms of movement, in terms of process. So you have to open your ears and let them awaken. What counts in a creative endeavor is the function of movement of a process and not the objective record status of a thing. What's objective in art is the activity and not the thing. While the so-called thing, which has been allowed to disappear into mystery, undergoes the transformation, and when it re-emerges, when it re-normalizes, it comes back exactly at the point of creative takeoff, which is attuned to, but not causally linked to, the previous setup linearity line of development. Now, it's very, very difficult to talk about. It's very easy to do. You train yourself to an endeavor which has a certain alignment, and at a strategic juncture in that alignment, you let it go. But you let it go with a kind of conscious grace. You realize that at this point, you have to let it be, and so you actively let it be. It's like telling your psyche that you're going to go to sleep now, but you want to wake up at 4:27.4 in the morning. And you can get yourself into a creative way so that you will wake yourself at 4:27.4 in the morning. Is it a mystery? Yes, it's a mystery. but it's a mystery which can be cooperated with all the exactness that one would want, and thus what one can say finally is that reality has a sense of play in its actuality. And if you play with it, it will play with you. And allow the invisible play to be an exact part of your alignment. And in just this way, we supersede all the angels and gods that have ever been. I think it says in the New Testament, Epistle to the Hebrews. We have a higher place in the order of the real than angels. For whatever angels has he said, you're a part of the family. They're messengers. They're just enzymes. We're the ones who get invited to the meal. Well, that's a vast difference. And that's the kind of character and courage and insight that 2,000 years ago allowed men and women to stand up to one of the most corrosive acid rains of all time, the Roman Empire in the imperial form. Because the Roman Empire in imperial form was not a matter of legions. It was a matter of imperial high magic, of controlling all the powers of the gods. Then indeed they did. Augustus Caesar made sure that all the powers of all the gods were in Rome, at the base of the Capitoline Hill, where you could keep track of them. They were put into a single building. That building was found in the rubble of Rome after the Second World War. It was still intact under about 20 feet of debris. And you can today go and take a tour. The Temple of Eternal Peace of Augustus Caesar. But all of the gods together constitute a fraying, time-limited form which eventually loses its efficacy. They do not transform. Part about the great unwashed ignorance of the contemporary world is this second-hand, third-rate indoctrination that somehow we transform because of personal mythologies. There are no personal mythologies, and there's no transformation in that phase at all. They interiorize. Images interiorize. Experience interiorizes. And what comes out of that certainly is the mind. But it is the mind that transforms. It is the mind that becomes visionary. And out of that visionary resonance, art makes creatively a new existence to express the real again, to re-emerge, to re-normalize what had been vanished. But in order to do this, one has to give up ritual. One has to give up ritual comportment. When one puts it into a kind of religious language, it almost sounds like a theological doctrine. In order to have your eternal person, you must give up your own existence. He who gives up his life gains everlasting life. That's how it was said. It's not a metaphysical statement. It's an aesthetic understanding that is profound. It was very difficult to even address this with any kind of certainty. It's something which is so elusive that one gains a neurotic sense of false security, courtesy of a projection of a regressive ego, much quicker than one could actually begin to develop the patient sensibility of seeing it actual out of the suspended childlike openness of the artist. And yet that's what we must do. So one of the first qualities in art is appreciation. And this appreciation comes out of the patience of openness. We don't know what this work of art is until we open ourselves to it. And that our experience gains a correlation to this work of art. So that if we look at our linearity again, at our line of development, nature, ritual, myth, symbol, vision, art. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Only 4 of which can be operative at any one time. And if we're bringing in art, we already have to have brought in vision. And to bring in vision, we already have to have brought in symbol. And symbol, we already have to have brought in myth. If we cling to, if we continue to have a ritual comportment, art's not going to happen. So one of the qualities that is universal about art is relinquishing our ritual comportment. Or to poetically speak about it, hold our existence lightly. In order to train the recalcitrant, monkish nature of men, the historical Buddha used to have them hold a gold thread between the pointer, the thumb and the middle fingers of each hand. And they would sit in a circle. All the monks sit in a circle with their sunlight robes, saffron robes, the color of sunlight. India, sunlight. They would hold this gold thread lightly, and then they could chant. Why? Because without that reminder to have this golden thread and let the energy just flow through you, ritual chanting in a circle holds you regressively in that level, and the art of trans-vision person making doesn't happen. And so all great artists learn to hold their creative energies lightly in their fingers or their ears or whatever working operative facility is being used, and not to clutch it, but to hold it lightly and let the creative juices flow through you. And in just this way, art peeks out of mystery and comes into actuality. Really happens. Now, in our need to have it re-emerge into form so that there is a form that comes up, artistic form, we have to have entered the mystery voluntarily, suspending a previous disciplined alignment, which we now add openness to as the next step. In other words, that alignment has to have been established. The points have to be arranged in that line, and then we have to consciously realize that the next point is going to be one of infinite size, and we don't know what extent it is. And if we do that, what will reemerge across the diameter of this infinitely circular point will be a creative point that's at the place of takeoff. Now, this is exactly how a generation of Americans went to the moon, because they were able to do the disciplined work of setting up the alignment, and then to do the imaginative work of letting the mystery play and being attentive long enough to catch the creative moment, the launch window, when they could go. And all that happened in about 20 years, between 1949 and 1969. All of that happened in that generation at that time. The technical capacity to go into space was already there in 1949, but the creative moment was not there. Just as an aside, a multi-stage rocket, the WAC and Corporal rocket, went to an altitude of 250 miles in 1949 and was the first object sent into space. But it didn't go into orbit, because to go into orbit you have to have an injection point at exactly the right place. Otherwise you fall back, or you have too much and you go on forever. To receive orbit insertion, you have to have an exacting point in terms of momentum and aligned correlation. Literally, you have to work with the whole planet, and indeed with the whole solar system, the whole star system, in order to mathematically find the orbit injection point. In 1949, it was not discernible where that point was. No one knew. Not just because no one had gone there, but because mathematically no one was quite sure how to do this. And when the realization of that came, when in the late 1950s, the realization that one did it exactly this way, it was like a beatific moment. It was in late autumnal 1957. I remember I was with a debating team in one of the outskirt towns of Detroit, Michigan. And there was the headlines about 5 inches high: Sputnik orbits the Earth. They were able to have the right insertion point mathematically so that Sputnik went around the Earth and did this dance with the movement of the planets. An incredible moment. I remember the first vehicle that soft landed on another planet was Surveyor 1. And it was such a mystical moment. I wrote a mystical poem about it called Surveyor and the Ocean of Storms, which is where it went. I'll read it to you sometime. But the ability to have the capacity not only to discern where the exact injection point would be, but to extend that to another heavenly body, the moon, another planet, and to make it so that it occurred exactly on the surface of that other planet. That was unbelievable. Pythagoras would have woken out of eternity to participate in watching that. We, in fact, set the TV screen out on this vast lawn at the University of Wisconsin because we couldn't believe that they were trying to do this and that they pulled it off. We were sweating tears. It was so uncanny. It was ghost-like. To have a ballet performer, even a machine, do that kind of leap and shut down its engines just 1 foot off the surface of the ocean of storms on another planet and just settle in, like Nijinsky cushioning himself. My God. Had they have held on to ritual, they could never have done it. It was an artistic performance. Space travel is an art. You can't just bludgeon your way there. There's no operative team today in the world that can go to the moon. Not in any country or anywhere. There's no team. It will take at least 7, 8 years to get a team that can go to the moon, just the moon. Because you can't just go. You can't just get there. It has to be correlated. There has to be a ballet. And you have to be able to land that one toe exactly right. Otherwise, it's game over. It's remarkably like person making. Because the reemergence that would come in vision, where the inner self, where the soul awakes out of that universal ocean, can be extended so that it occurs exactly in a form which has a life path, like a conscious being. So that you refocus not deep in the mystery of the inner realm, but you come awake exactly there on the liminal beginning of a personal life, one's own existence, personally expressed. That can be done. Now, it used to be, thousands of years ago, that could only be taught one-on-one. And very rarely, one would sometimes wait a whole lifetime for someone who could learn that. Who had the patience, who had the skill, who had the courage, the tenacity to do that. Teachers used to choose their students much more carefully than students choosing their teachers. But this is a whole different aeon. The whole process now needs to be done for 1 billion people at a time. It's like one of the visionary writings of Thomas Jefferson, who said that there have been free men and women in history. Occasionally, there are whole groups of them. But what's wrong with trying an experiment to have several million free men and women at the same time and see what they would do? And so his whole theory of political form was a provisional form that collapses immediately upon the arrival of a generation of new men and women who have new freedom and variability, which they need to find out about. And that to have a ritualistic, ongoing form of government is the height of slavery and Roman imperial imitation. Came out in one of his letters to Madison. He said, we need a revolution every 19 years. Only not our revolution. Whatever those men and women decide that they need, they should have the right. The phrase came out, the earth belongs to the living, not to the dead. And so this kind of education very quickly has applicability. You want to talk about applicability? It has applicability anywhere that human beings can focus their attention, on any level, on any scale. But before we get into those kinds of applications, we have to learn to be ourselves, and not ourselves in some ritualistic mode, but ourselves as the artist bringing our own person into a live activity. That's important. No one can do that for us, but we can together go through that mysterious process of setting up the alignments in a way in which one can get an energy momentum going, and not only a single energy momentum, because you can't do it just with vector permutations. You have to have a tensor calculus, which means you have to have 2 or more vectors. Once Levi Civita was able to get the paralleled covalence and contravalence, that symmetrical form and high energy states would hold. He got interested in what would happen with three bodies revolving around each other, and he developed the math for that also. We still use his math for star systems that have 3 stars in. We use the same math. It used to be hard to find in Italian libraries, Levi Civita's work on that, because Mussolini had all that thrown out, of course. Il Duce said, "My God, he's a Jew." As if it made any difference. We need to keep track of the way in which an infinite variability, not just 2 or 3 vectors, but any number. And so we train ourselves to look at a whole field instead of a thing. And by considering even a point, not to just be a point as a thing, but a point as a field of points, is the beginning of intelligence. It's the beginning of being able to use, like on a level of tensor calculus, an application that will yield the delicate form of the person creatively and allow us to cooperate with mystery. But what must be opened is vision. The openness, the hiatus, the creative hiatus is there in vision. Art is on the other side of vision. We need to open up the ocean of vision so that mind, objectively formed on this side of the ocean, is willing to stop at the beach, at the wave's edge, and gesture openness to the other side of the world. Mind needs to stop being itself and relinquish its ritual basis and just open itself up to the mystery. And if one has prepared a movement, a resultant of many, many vectors beforehand into a kind of a tensor approach, one will enter the mystery in such a way that when you come out again on the other shore, you will come out creatively yourself, creatively alive, expressively potent. Whatever you could imagine before, you can now remember to do. And so imagination has a particular quality if it's not to become egotistical. It has to have a demarcation where it will go no further, not because it can't or doesn't want to, but because it wants to exactly begin an openness here. And so by that freedom of positing our moment, of stopping the ritual alignment which was so necessary before, by having that freedom to stop that, we also initiate this creative moment that will certainly come. This waking up, this aurora, this dawning, this coming awake on the other side. In order to do that, we have to remind ourselves to hush the ego. Not throttle it. Not cuff it around. But like a brilliant but unruly child, let's just sit for a while. Let's see what happens. And after a while, even with the most autistic of all brilliant children, they become fascinated by the fact that something happens out of that, unbidden. And what happens is that the line takes up again, but takes up again at a point that's a takeoff. That's important. And that's what we're trying to sensitize ourselves to. Now, Kandinsky and John Dewey, the pair of books that we're using to start art with, Art as Experience Concerning the Spiritual in Art. Kandinsky's Art as Experience coming roughly around 1930, Concerning the Spiritual Art coming around 1913. Just 17 years in between the two. That generation. We need to remind ourselves that at the time that Kandinsky was coming out with Concerning the Spiritual in Art, 1913, 1914, right there at that time, is exactly the same time that Einstein was discovering Levi-Civita's tensor calculus, applications to differential geometry. And it's exactly at that moment that art and science both had a release point, a tremendous release point. And that one can come to an understanding of this by recognizing that the discussion about point and line, the two fundamental properties of geometry, point and line, were current in both areas, art and science. If we come to, that's fine, let it be. If we come to Tullio's book, which influenced Einstein so much in his specific and special theory of relativity and his other writings. The very first page, the absolute differential calculus. Notice it doesn't mention integration. It mentions differential calculus. Because we're dealing with consciousness now. We're not dealing with the integral energy, but with the differential energy. We're talking about geometrical terminology. Eventually he comes to talk about the term point and how a point becomes a line. And if we have, for this purpose it is essential to adopt the fundamental convention of using the term point, and then he extends the phrase, point of an abstract n dimensions manifold. In other words, a point not just as a little bitty thing you make with the point of a pencil, not that point, but any point, a point of abstract n-dimensional manifold. N being any positive integer whatsoever, to denote a set of n values assigned to any n variables, that one has then, instead of a line being the movement of a point, one has the line as an accumulation of form of all the points within that n dimension manifold. This is due to that Englishman Hamilton, Hamiltonian space. And with the interruption of these messages, you can see that the Bodhi tree is calling exactly at the time, but not to learn, but to sell. And I, of course, not to teach, but to buy. On the left side, if you'll push the button back, you'll find a little lever on the left side. Don't you love Los Angeles? Actually, LA works if you're willing to let the mystery happen. If you insist on every part of LA of being real, you're quickly going to leave town. There are only certain oases of reality that are real for you, and vast mysteries of just open nothingness. But if you allow both those things to occur, LA has those creative points that really take off and happen. it's a hermetic city. It's special made, just like ancient Alexandria, to be a mystery school. LA is a mystery school. It's not a city like New York or Paris or London. It's a place like Alexandria. It's just a mystery school. You can't live naturally in LA, but you can play supernaturally in LA. So if you just want to get by, go back to your tribal grounds. But if you want to futz around in high style, you're in the right place, because you can really do it here. It's made for that. Tullio writes, if the x's, if all these x's are n functions of a real variable t, like time, if all these x's are functions of a real variable, then when t varies continuously between t sub 0 and t sub 1, in between 0 and 1, when it varies in between being a thing and being no thing, as it varies infinitely in between these, no matter where it is, no matter how complex that variability is, in fact, the more variable it is, the better the symmetries work at higher and higher energies. One paradoxically comes to understand the mystery of reality more and more exactly as one comes to accept graciously its ineffability. And what would seem absolutely verboten, I think that was their word, for human beings, is that in ultimate play we come to experience the exact of the real. Tullio Levi-Civita writes, we simply get an infinite succession of points, the aggregate of which is called a line. And more precisely, an arc or segment of a line, because space is curved. Always curved. Why? Straight lines always fall in a universe that's vast enough. They always do. It's only when we insist on remaining tribally secure that anything further than that horizon belongs to a different tribe, and we're going to get them one of these days. When we get over that kind of myopic, neurotic, anxiety-engendering stupidity, then we can all explore together and find that this universe is so vast that straight lines fall. And when you have a matrix of 4, minimally 4, covariant or contravariant, doesn't make any difference, functions, when you have that kind of tensor matrix, then you have the beginnings of this universe as it really is. Now you can go a lot of places from there, but none of them are real until you go. That is, none of them are real until you begin to go, and then they achieve their reality as you begin to go. If you stop, they're not going to ever be there. Whereas if you continue, the longer you continue on the more subtle level, the more they are there. So that you actually achieve exactly what you really did, but not ritualistically, artistically. That's what today's lecture is all about. It's all about that. Now we'll come back next week. We'll come back to this in a little bit different direction. What we need to do in the meantime is to recognize that we have a couple of levels of projects that are going on, of art activities, of doing something. And that the whole purpose of these activities is to get us to unlearn ritual doing and to participate in visionary-based artistic activity, art doing. We want to undo the ritual and to do the art. Right? So it's like Black American English. If I was Flip Wilson, I could give you a sermon. We want to not do the old do, but to do the new do. Because with the new do, then you too are something.